Thank you for this time to speak. And I do believe we had one slide for my presentation. Please hold it and don't bring it up yet. I had some prepared comments, and I'll get to that second. But with Sue's kind permission, I've thought a lot about this sort of fundamental conundrum with patients desperately needing and wanting funding, and NIH coming through with funding in amounts that are smaller than meet the needs. So I'd like to sort of make my intention here is to try to look at both sides. I know I understand the patient side, and yesterday to Vicki and Cheryl, thank you very much for your explanation of the process, because it helped me much better understand your process and how it comes together. So my intention is to sort of try to bridge that gap and see. So I want to make some couple observations and then come back to a request of NIH. So the observation is, and this I do know, is that ME/CFS researchers, of which there are many, have stopped submitting. We do get trained, and when application after application, even when extraordinarily well written, is turned away, we do learn to take our time and money elsewhere. And so I think the sad truth is that researchers have been trained not to submit, not always, but in general. And I guess what's really brought me to think about this is, as I talk with patients and patient advocates, what I hear is, my gosh, we're hearing this, the conversations continue. What we're hearing this year is similar to what was heard 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, regarding NIH's goodwill, interest in this disease, and wanting to move forward. So I can't quite put the two together. So let me just make some observations. One is, and we all know this, ME, I'll call it that, is a very complex, serious disease that doesn't have a home at NIH. And we know that not having a home at NIH is problematic. And then from the NIH side, it has a very clearly defined, effective method for making decisions about what research grants to make, using unbiased review panels and unbiased study groups, with leadership among them, and your openness and willingness to consider all sorts of different projects, and the highest regard for integrity, and knowing that federal dollars, all of our dollars as citizens, have to be spent on the best science. And that's all good and well and good. The fundamental disconnect, though, is that process doesn't work for this illness. And let me talk about why I say this. And to use an analogy, I think it's your classic round peg in a square hole. So here is the patient group with this huge round peg, and we keep talking about how huge the round peg. Now we've got the IOM, who's affirmed very clearly how desperate the need is for this. We've got the P2P essentially saying the same thing. Year after year after year, we have patients who come forward, mustering all their strength to come and give testimony, so that we see this, and it's depending upon the count, up to 2.5 million Americans. We know the burden on our American economy is enormous. So we see this huge round peg of need. And then what looks to us like the tiny, tiny NIH square hole of funding. So we are trying to figure out how to fit ourselves in through that tiny square hole. And I think one of the issues, and we know that you need to have sufficient sample size to write a proposal that will have merit. Well, I think we understand the aspects of ME/CFS that have made having sufficient sample sizes, available for that. We know that it's hard to write the proposal when the definition of the illness has been all over the place, and it's hard to have the integrity we need to fit through that round hole, and it's a small hole. Even really well written proposals in cancer and autism and MS, 88% are rejected. So how do we, who come to the table to fit through that tiny square hole, knowing that our hands are tied behind our back before we even start. We lack sufficient money for seed studies to get the sample sizes we need. We lack the the definitions of the illness to have the integrity we want. So that we come to it with our hands tied behind our back. And you add to that then study panels in which you have people of goodwill, very smart, capable people of goodwill. But when, even for the best known diseases, there's an 88% failure rate on proposals, 12% positive. You know, it only takes one individual on a study panel who doesn't know ME, who still believes it's, worst case, believes it's psychosomatic. Okay, but even putting that aside, says, hey, it doesn't fit here because it doesn't go in this illness. It's clearly a multi-symptom disease that goes across many other illnesses. Doesn't fit here. Doesn't really understand. We know it takes a long time to understand the subtleties and nuances of this. And so I would submit that this problem that we've seen year after year after year is that we got a huge problem, and we've got this desperate patient population in pain, trying to fit through the tiny square hole in which we cannot fit. We cannot, as long as unbiased reviewers are on the panel, in a perverse way, because they don't understand our illness in depth. That's a kind of bias. It's counterintuitive. I think the only way we get, so how do we get past this? And I think the only ways that I know are to recognize that ME is a different kind of illness, and we know that NIH can have enormous creativity and enormous flexibility in what it does. You know, Francis Collins is a brilliant, flexible, creative gentleman. And so we know NIH can think about complex new problems in different ways. And I am saying that's what is needed for this illness. Recognize the differences, recognize the deficiencies from which we come to the table, and remember how huge that round peg of pain and despair is. So I think I would ask NIH to look at handling ME in a different manner, put it in some kind of special category with its own set of funds, so that when our research proposals come forward that must have the highest scientific integrity, we get that, but that they're competing among other ME research studies that have the similar problems and deficiencies, the lack of definition, the lack of large sample size that are convincing. So, because when we compete against those other illnesses who have such a strong base of research, you know, we don't have a shot. So I would ask for an independent, separate set of funds set aside for ME/CFS, so we got a shot. And I would also ask for review panels who are consistent from year to year and who have really spent the time to understand this illness in all its steps, and who can discern the subtle nuances among the different elements of this illness and understand why the problem of the definition is problematic. And I think until there are designated separate funds for ME and folks that we know are on those panels, none of whom will scoff at this, I think that's the only way we get out of this chicken and egg problem that we've been in for decades. So I appeal to you. I know you both to be capable and caring individuals here, and I think it's that kind of systemic change specific to this illness, and systemic changes have been made for other illnesses. That's the only way we get past this. It's not taking the grant back for the 4th, 5th, 6th time, because we're not going to get through that little square hole. So that's my point of view. So.